Our first new break support in a year is coming, and she has a lot to fix. Over the past year, Hoyo has absolutely dumpstered break and created lots of new problems for it. And Constance just about fixes all of them. I'm not sure a new support has ever been so impactful to an archetype, at minimum doubling the team's damage. But the way they've chosen to do that comes at a cost, isn't perfect, and leaves room for a very different, equally impactful support in the future. The biggest thing Constance does is allow super break damage to be dealt even before the enemy is actually broken. This is huge and pretty much entirely why she's so strong. Instead of dealing no damage like half the time and being the absolute most dependent on damage windows, break can now deal damage all the time, doing a complete 180 and really having quite consistent and constant damage now. You can see how this would make her basically automatically double team damage, as you can now simply deal damage twice as often, or more. Because one of the biggest problems Hoyo created for break is toughness bar inflation, increasing time and again how long enemies take to break, and thus how long break had to wait before it could do anything. But there are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, and most obviously, it is just a big change. The archetype has had its identity changed from having the most focus on damage windows to having some of the least. Even just said simply, super break no longer cares about break, sounds a bit wrong, doesn't it? And Constance goes all in on that. In terms of just raw damage amping, she isn't actually a very large improvement. The actual damage number you see might only be a little over 10% or so higher than before with her, which basically means her kit goes all in on super break and its increased uptime, which isn't ideal for either the other two break characters or the future of the archetype. It's hard to imagine how future super break characters could be very interesting or very different to Firefly. Boothill and Rappa already get slightly less from Dahlia due to having more things in their kit that actually want break. She doesn't do nothing to help break characters actually break enemies. She's another character with weakness break efficiency in her kit, giving you the option of stacking it instead of super break multiplier, but that's not as impactful as just more than doubling the amount of time you can deal damage. And before her kit came out, I expected something different. The problem that actively had to be solved in order for anyone to give a shit and consider rolling for a break character after being burned so hard this past year is toughness bar values. Constance didn't really have a choice but to irrevocably change break. The loss and change in identity isn't her fault. It's the anti-shelling of the past years. Killing instead of shelling break at every turn over the past year was the mistake and what changed break. She did have to give some way of totally not giving a fuck how large an enemy's toughness bar is. So, I actually don't think what they have done is bad for break's identity. After an initial negative gut reaction, I think it does actually kind of fit fine for super break. Super break from its inception changes break to allow the characters to deal damage more frequently with their break effect stat. While you're dealing super break damage, there's not much difference between dealing super break damage when an enemy is broken and when they aren't. It just made it so you want to break the enemy as fast as possible, which you always do anyway for lower resistances. And Boot Hill and Rappa both have other reasons to still care too, as well anyway. I ultimately don't think it really hurts the identity of Break as much as it might seem to. The way I thought they might fix the toughness inflation, though, was more like her E1. Instead of making Superbreak just not care whether the enemies were broken, which seemed way too big of a change to me before her kit released, I thought she might change toughness damage to be dealt to a break bar as a percentage, rather than a flat value, allowing break characters to no longer care about changes in enemy toughness and instead always be able to break enemies in about as much time as they were able to at their peak. Instead, I now think that might be the future of Break, rather than its present. A support that brings Break back to Break, more than it ever actually has even. That makes characters care more than ever about that one specific instance of actual Break, and makes getting that more consistent. Both to really support the other two Break characters, and because there are a lot of really interesting and fun gameplay possibilities with that can be unique from Firefly. Whether by doing percentage-based toughness damage, or stacks and unique benefits like Boot Hill and Rappa have, enemy action advances so that teams can also unbreak enemies and loop their break damage, or by focusing on massive chunks of damage from the initial break hit and not much else. While that last one does seem quite unlikely due to the speed of this game's meta, not really allowing teams to have clear weaknesses anymore, as well as the difficulty in balancing it, it would allow them to make basically a complete sub-archetype out of Break that wouldn't have to compete with Firefly so much. And the alternative is making Break in general doomed to antiquity. Firefly is just too popular. Ultimately, I think you might be able to argue that she is the source of all of Break's problems. She needed anti-shield to get people off of their OP Fireflies and rolling on 3.x characters because nobody really rolled for Boot Hill and Rappa, the only other two dedicated 5-star Break characters. Firefly could just fill the role, so people felt no need for them. But that means they can't really make new Break DPS to make it fully worthwhile keeping the archetype alive. And unlike Kafka, Firefly can't really be transitioned into a support. They've clearly learnt in general from Boot Hill and Rappa that people aren't necessarily interested in alternative characters of the same archetype just because they go after a different enemy target count. 3.x characters don't really care so much about their path and just deal strong damage to anyone for the most part. Instead, trying to have more unique playstyles and other reasons to pull them. That might actually be why they insisted on Mighty being auto-only, for example, to try and differentiate him more from Castoris. Taking away an option doesn't really work as a selling point though. Otherwise, they have avoided making any characters in the same archetype compete. Evernight and Castoris, for example, aren't alternate use case DPSs like a Hunt and Erudition version of HP Memo Sprite characters that you use in different fights. They're designed to be put on the same team. But that does mean that if they do make new Break characters, it is very likely that they will be different. whether that's by making them not really able to take good advantage of super break and instead focusing on the actual break, or something else. It's impossible to actually tell what right now. The game just changes far too fast for even its own good. But the most likely thing right now might be a support that action advances the enemy, because Constance sets up a future support to be able to do that without it being a massive issue for existing carries. Thanks to her, break isn't reliant on enemies being broken for as long as possible anymore. It doesn't necessarily have to be reliant on the delay that does to enemies. So rather than, in a year's time when break is dog shit again, releasing a support that just has like 1,000% super break multiplier to more than double their damage again via increasing the raw damage, which Constance doesn't really do, like I said. Now that the uptime can't be improved, which she does do and has already solved, they can release a support that can take advantage of that and make enemies consistently easier to break with a built-in effect like Constance's E1, and make breaks more frequent by action advancing the enemy. Then, when that forces you to use a sustain, you can also take advantage of Constance's trace buff. That future support might even be a sustain, because an enemy action advance also double dips with Dot. Dot also needs a dedicated sustain and also has had its identity a little bit compromised in order to keep up with the meta. Now focusing on uptime and consistency through detonations instead of delayed peaky damage, just like break. Heck, make the new support character Nihility with good buffs and debuff applications when they heal the damage that the enemy they just advanced dealt, and you also have a massive Acheron upscale as well. Making a 3-in-1 legacy support seems a bit too good to be true, and it is, but at a certain point they will have to start consolidating in order to keep up with all of the legacies that need supported if they want to be able to actually leverage and get any value out of their large back catalogue of characters. Actually, it being a 3-in-1 would also work to still force people to have new units, since all of your old teams would be dependent on the same single support, leaving you requiring a second modern team. I also have a theory that we might not actually have to wait as long as we think to get more break or dot support, as now the anti-shill is over and everyone who can be made to switch off and roll new characters they have to instead shill and rebuild confidence in these archetypes in order to get better sales from their legacy supports. Everyone's concern with Constance is whether break will just fall off a cliff again, but to me it makes sense for them to regularly, but occasionally, release new supports for these old characters to keep them up to par after the initial period of making people roll the new characters by sheer force of shill, to profit off of their dedicated fans who, if they haven't already switched to, say, Castoris by this point, aren't going to. And dedication means they're more likely to roll duplicates, which means more money. They would just be leaving money on the table from characters that have already been made, work that has already been done and paid for. But who knows, I expected more fucking buffs by now, for example. I can say it makes sense for break and dot to receive more support in future and be kept relevant, if not tip-top, and even for Firefly to be buffed as was leaked a long time ago, but unfortunately that doesn't mean much. Hoyo doesn't do things that make sense all the time. But now that the game has gone on long enough for us to start really getting units made exclusively to support old characters, and that have to massively shake up the mechanics to do so, it's interesting to think about what the future holds. Don't get hung up on anything I've said. I don't want to create any expectations or even excitement from any of my random ideas on how future characters could address problems and redefine their archetypes again, because they won't happen. It's simply too far away in a game with a meta that goes too fast. We don't even know what problems the future will have to solve. And Star Rail has actually quite consistently surprised me with the directions it has gone and what it has been willing to do. I just wanted to talk not just about Constance, but also the possibility for a pure break support that goes back to its roots from before it was able to be super. Thanks for watching. Subscribe please if you enjoyed and want more videos like this. Until next time, bye.